In this tutorial, we will start covering chapter 8.5 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. This chapter covers how to use JPQL to create different statements in order to work with database records. So following tutorials show how to create JPQL statements by using either createQuery method, query annotation on repository method, or named query annotation on the entity class. Such statements can be referenced from repository or code. JPQL stands for Java Persistence Query Language. JPQL can be used to work with database by creating select, update, and delete database statements. JPQL does not support insert statement. JPQL parameters can be indexed or named. So here is a quick overview of how to use these three different ways of creating JPQL statements. So as already said, JPQL statements can be created by using createQuery method of the entity manager. To do so, we can create a string that contains our statement JPQL, in this case a select JPQL statement. Such statement can have parameters, and these parameters can be either indexed or named. So first, string shows how to create select statement JPQL statement with index parameters, and the second string shows how to create a JPQL statement with named parameters. Once we create a string that contains our JPQL statement, we can use that string to create our query JPQL by calling createQuery method of the entity manager. This method takes a parameter, that string that contains JPQL, and in this case it also contains a second parameter, because in this case we are expecting JPQL to return our person entity, but generally this second parameter is not always used. We can now set the values of our parameters, so this code shows how to set values if we are using index parameters by specifying the index and then the value, and this line shows how to specify named parameters by specifying the name of the parameter and then its value. So once the query is created, we can execute it by calling its getSingleResult method and then casting the result into the person entity to get our person entity. For update and delete statements, we will have a different method here. So this is very shortly how createQuery works. And then we have already said that JPQL can also be created by using query annotation on repository methods. Then when the method is called, it will execute specified JPQL and return its result, and this JPQL statement will be contained within this query annotation. Now, method can return either entity, collection of entities, or specific properties as DTO, array of object containing these properties, string, or scalar. If JPQL has parameters, then related method must have equal number of input parameters. We can also use param annotation to map between JPQL and input parameters when they have different names. Modifying and transactional annotations must be added to methods that perform update or delete. So here is an example of what was just said. So inside the person repository, we have these two methods which are annotated by using query annotation which specifies our JPQL queries. And then these queries can be referenced from our code by calling the method that is being annotated. So if we want to execute this query, we have to call this method with these parameters, and then these values of these parameters will be used as values of index parameters of JPQL. And in this example, our method is returning a single person entity. In this next example, we again use query annotation to specify our JPQL query, and this time we are using named parameters. To execute this JPQL query, we only need to call this method that was annotated with this annotation, and this method takes two parameters. These parameters, values of these parameters will be used as values for these named parameters. Now, if the name of the JPQL query parameter is the name exactly the same as the name of input parameter into this method, then this will be used as the mapping. But if the name of the JPQL parameter is different than the name of the input parameter, then we can use param annotation to do the mapping in order to say that JPQL parameter name par should be mapped to this input parameter. In the previous example, our method returned a single person entity, but here we want to show that it can also return a collection of person entities. Once we define our repository methods, we can then call them as usually from our code by referencing repository instance and then calling the method and giving the values to parameters, input parameters of the method, and then when the queries are executed, we will receive the return value, either person entity for this method or collection of person entities for this method. And finally, we have said the JPQL query can also be created as a named query, that is by using named query annotation that is used to annotate entity class. So here is an example of a person entity where we have used name query annotation to specify the JPQL with following name. So now this JPQL can be referenced from a repository by adding a method to a repository which should have the same name as the name given inside the entity class. This method needs to have the same number of input parameters as expected by the JPQL, which here expects two named parameters, and we can again use param annotation to map JPQL parameter with input parameter of the method if the names are not the same. And if we are using update or delete statements, then these methods should also be flagged as transactional and modifying. So this is how we can reference it from person repository, and then in order to use it, we just call the person repository method. Now the other way in which we can reference these named queries is directly from the code by using create named query method of the entity manager and then referencing its full name as shown here. Then we can set query parameters like that. So this line shows how to set parameters if they are index parameters, and this would set parameter at index 2 with following value, and this is how we set JPQL parameters if it is using named parameters by specifying the name of the parameter and then the value. And then we can execute query by calling get single result, or for update and delete, this will be a different method as we will show later. So this is just a quick overview of 3 ways in which we can create JPQL statements by calling create query method of the entity manager, by using query annotation to annotate methods inside a repository, or by using named query annotation to an entity class to create named JPQLs, which can then be referenced either from repository by using the same name, by creating method that has the same name as the named query, or from the code by using create named query method of the entity manager and then specifying values for the input parameters and then executing the query.